I want to start by making one thing very clear. I live a completely sober lifestyle. No drinking, no substances, nothing that could alter my perception of reality. So when I tell you what happened last New Year's Eve, understand that it wasn't some trick of the mind, no hallucination, no confusion. It was real. I live near a small, quiet town in the south, the kind of place where most people know each other and where the outskirts fade into miles of thick, unbroken woods. Some of my friends live even deeper in those rural areas, their houses only accessible by winding country back roads that seem to stretch on forever, shrouded by towering trees. One of my closest friends, Darren, comes from a well-off family. Their home is part of an upscale neighborhood hidden deep in those woods, far from the main roads. Every year, Darren's family throws a big New Year's Eve party, inviting relatives, friends, and close acquaintances. I've been attending for as long as I can remember, and it's always one of the highlights of the holiday season. When I received the formal invitation in the mail, I was looking forward to the night ahead. Now, winters in the south can be unpredictable. It had been unseasonably warm for most of December, but in the days leading up to New Year's Eve, a sudden cold snap hit. By the time I set out for the party, the temperature had dropped significantly, and the road conditions were far from ideal. The back roads were rough and uneven, making the drive uncomfortable. I usually avoid using my high beams because I hate when other drivers blind me with theirs, but that night, the darkness was so overwhelming that I had no choice. Even with my brights on, the dense tree line on either side of the road seemed to swallow up the light, making every turn feel like I was plunging into the unknown. For miles, there were no houses, no streetlights, nothing but that long, narrow road cutting through the forest. The only structure along the route was an old shack, barely visible through the trees. It looked abandoned, but on rare occasions, I had noticed a faint glow inside, like someone had lit a candle or a weak lamp. I never gave it much thought before. Then, somewhere along a particularly straight stretch of road, my headlights caught something up ahead, something stark white against the sea of darkness. At first, it was just a vague shape, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person. A woman. She stood completely still at the edge of the trees, not attempting to move or hide. Her body faced the road, but her eyes, if she had them, were locked straight ahead, unfocused. She was dressed in white, wearing a long gown that looked thin and completely inappropriate for the bitter cold. My high beams reflected off the fabric, making it difficult to see any finer details. I kept driving, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. Every instinct in me screamed not to stop. I told myself she was probably just someone heading to the party, maybe a guest whose car had broken down. But when I glanced in my rearview mirror, my breath caught in my throat. She had turned. Not moved. Not walked. Just rotated in place. She was still standing there, frozen at the edge of the road, but now she was facing me. A deep unease settled in my gut, but I pushed it aside and focused on reaching Darren's house. Soon, I pulled into the long driveway and parked among the other cars gathered in the gravel clearing outside. The party was in full swing, laughter and music spilling from the warmly lit house. Inside, the atmosphere was lively, festive, and filled with the comforting normalcy of people enjoying the holiday. I let myself forget about the woman on the road, at least for a while. As the night went on, we counted down to midnight, watching the ball drop in New York before celebrating our own time zone's arrival of the new year. Slowly, guests began filtering out, heading home. As usual, I stayed behind to help clean up. By the time I stepped outside, my car was the only one left in the driveway. That's when I noticed the dashboard warning, low tire pressure. My car was old, so it didn't specify which tire was low, only that there was an issue. I wasn't too concerned. Sudden temperature drops often messed with my tires, and I figured I'd be fine for the drive home. But then a thought crept into my mind. What if that woman was still out there? I had another route I could take to avoid that back road, but it would add at least 20 extra minutes to my drive. At that hour, I didn't want to risk running into any reckless, drunk drivers. So, against my better judgment, I chose the shortcut. I regretted it almost immediately. Not long after I started driving, I noticed something was wrong. A strange, grating sound echoed through the still night air, a metallic scraping, like something grinding against the pavement. My car slowed to a stop on its own. My stomach twisted. I knew I shouldn't, but I had no choice. I had to check my tires. I stepped out, shutting the door behind me. The second I did, the world around me was swallowed by darkness. My car's automatic lights faded out, leaving me completely alone on the desolate road. The only illumination came from my phone's flashlight as I bent down to inspect the damage. My breath caught in my throat. Every single one of my tires had been destroyed. Not punctured. Not deflated. Shredded. It looked as if something with massive claws had torn through them with terrifying precision. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. One tire? Maybe. But all four? That wasn't an accident. That was deliberate. Then, everything around me went silent. The wind stopped. The rustling trees stilled. Even the distant sounds of nocturnal wildlife vanished. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Then, a snap. A twig breaking somewhere in the darkness. I turned off my flashlight, standing completely still. Something, or someone, was nearby, moving through the trees. A whisper carried through the air, soft and chilling. "I see you." My blood ran cold. The voice was barely above a murmur, but it was unmistakably clear. Feminine. Calm. Then, another whisper. "Can you see me?" Every muscle in my body screamed for me to run, but I was frozen in place. My mind raced. If I turned my flashlight back on, I'd reveal my position, but I also needed to see where to go. With a shaking hand, I flicked the light on and pointed it toward the trees. She was there, the woman in white. Standing at the edge of the tree line, her gown now filthy and covered in dark stains. Her body was gaunt, skeletal. Her tangled gray hair hung over her face, which was barely recognizable as human. The worst part? Her jaw. Or what was left of it. A grotesque, gaping wound had replaced the lower half of her face, but somehow, she was still smiling. I didn't think. I just ran. I sprinted back toward Darren's house, my heart pounding. I could hear her behind me, branches breaking, footsteps rushing after me. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I reached the house, slamming my fists against the door, screaming for someone to let me in. When Darren's mother finally opened it, I stumbled inside, breathless and shaking. I tried to explain, but the words barely came out. They let me stay the night, calling the police to check the road. But when I woke up at 3:14 a.m., I heard it again. A soft tapping on the window. And that same whisper. "I see you." The woman was still out there, her presence looming like a shadow that followed me all the way to Darren's house. She had chased me here, and now, from outside, she started throwing rocks to get my attention. There was no way I was going to look out that window. I wasn't about to leave the safety of the bed I'd curled up in, not until the sun rose in the morning, and Darren's family was up. Only then would I feel somewhat safe. When dawn finally broke and the house stirred awake, I told Darren's family everything. We all looked outside together before the police arrived. They came to investigate the area where I had heard the woman's voice. Darren's father found a large, rusty knife in the yard, one that didn't belong to anyone in the family. It seemed like the weapon the woman had used to slash my tires, which also meant she had followed me there, all the way from the party earlier that night. The terrifying thing was that she had singled me out, waiting until everyone else was inside, enjoying the festivities, before targeting me. Darren's parents contacted the other party guests to see if anyone had noticed anything unusual, and one of their friends mentioned seeing a figure in a white dress wandering outside, but they assumed it was just another guest coming and going. When I gave my statement to the police, I told them to check out the shack on the road. Something about it didn't sit right with me, and I had a gut feeling that the woman was connected to it. They followed up and came back with an unsettling update. There was no one living there, but they had found a grisly sight, dead, gutted wildlife scattered across the woods nearby. Despite all the police investigation, the woman was never found, leaving behind a web of questions that still haunts me. The most chilling ones are how she managed to track me down so quickly after I left the party, and how, with her face so badly mangled, she was able to speak so clearly. Even with all of this weighing on my mind, I'll still go back to Darren's house for New Year's Eve this year. But this time, I'm taking extra precautions. I'll carpool with others and make sure to take the long way around, just in case. When I was 26, I decided to take a short trip to San Diego. I booked a flight and spent a few days staying with a friend, enjoying my time there. Eventually, it was time to head back home, and I scheduled a late-night flight. By the time my plane landed, it was already midnight. After collecting my things and making my way to the ground transportation pickup zone, it was about 12:30 a.m. Since I didn't want to wait for an Uber, I walked over to the taxi section and flagged down a random cab. The driver rolled down his window, and I gave him my home address. He quickly agreed to take me for $30, which was actually a great deal compared to what I would have paid on a rideshare app. The driver, who seemed friendly enough at first, stepped out of the vehicle, ready to help with my luggage. However, I insisted that I could handle it myself, and instead of putting my bag in the trunk, I placed it in the seat next to me. He lifted my bag onto the left side seat behind him, while I sat diagonally across from him. Once we were both settled, he pulled up the GPS for directions to my apartment, and we hit the road. My place was roughly a 30-minute drive from the airport, and given the late hour, there was virtually no traffic. As we sped down the highway, I noticed something unsettling. The driver was watching me through the rearview mirror. The first time, I brushed it off as coincidence. The second time, however, it felt intentional. Then, breaking the silence, he asked me where I was flying in from. I casually responded, "San Diego." He nodded and replied, "Oh, nice," before quickly following up with another question, "What were you doing there?" I told him I was visiting a friend who lived in the city. That's when things started feeling strange. With a smirk, he asked, "Is your friend as pretty as you?" At first, I let out an awkward laugh, unsure how to react. But deep down, the comment immediately unsettled me. The fact that this was only the third thing he had said during the ride made it even worse. From that moment on, his questions took on an unmistakable flirtatious tone. "So, what's a beautiful girl like you doing traveling all alone?" he asked. I decided to push back a little, keeping my tone confident yet firm. "Well, I wasn't alone," I corrected him. "I was visiting my friend." But he wasn't letting it go. He chuckled and countered, "But you flew by yourself, didn't you? That means you were traveling alone." I refused to engage with his logic, replying with a simple, "Let's just agree to disagree." He laughed and claimed he was only teasing, but I wasn't buying it. The whole interaction made my skin crawl. This man had to be at least in his mid-40s, and the way he was hitting on me, a young woman in her 20s, felt completely inappropriate. Trying to shake off the discomfort, I glanced out the window. I recognized the overpass near my exit, and I expected the driver to slow down. But instead, he sped right past it. My stomach dropped. "That was my exit," I said, my voice sharp with urgency. The driver barely reacted. I raised my voice, more insistent this time. "Hey, that was my exit." He finally responded with an apology, claiming he would take the next one. Alarm bells started going off in my head. I leaned forward, trying to get a look at the GPS on his screen, but the way it was positioned made it impossible to see. Was he actually following the route to my home, or was he taking me somewhere else entirely? As the next exit approached, I made sure to be crystal clear. "You need to take this exit. Right now." For a second, he didn't acknowledge me. Then, without saying a word, he turned on his blinker and merged off the highway. But something about the way he looked at me through the mirror sent a chill down my spine. There was a flicker of something, annoyance? Frustration? I wasn't sure, but I didn't like it. Then, as if trying to regain control of the conversation, he threw out another question. "So, do you have a boyfriend?" I didn't hesitate for a second. "Yes. He lives with me." His eyes flickered up to the mirror again, studying me. He must have noticed how quickly I answered, because then he asked, "What's his name?" At that point, my patience had run out. I grabbed my AirPods and shoved them into my ears, even though they were almost dead. I didn't care. I just needed an excuse to stop talking to this man. His interrogation felt bizarre, like he was trying to gauge how alone I really was. I discreetly grabbed my phone and texted my family and closest friends, sharing my location. If anything happened, at least someone would know where I was. Unfortunately, it was past 1 a.m. on a weeknight, so most of them were asleep. The only person who responded was my older brother, but he lived 2 hours away. His advice? If you feel unsafe, get out of the car. Now. A few minutes later, we stopped at a red light. I glanced up at the mirror and immediately regretted it. His eyes were locked on me, staring intensely. My heart pounded. The light turned green. He didn't move. I had to physically tell him, "The light is green." Only then did he start driving again. Then, up ahead, I spotted something, an empty parking lot with a police car parked inside. It was now or never. Without thinking, I grabbed my bag and threw open the van door. The driver immediately panicked. "What are you doing?" he shouted, trying to close the door with the automatic button. But I wasn't waiting around to find out his next move. I forced the door open and sprinted toward the police car. Behind me, I expected to hear the sound of him slamming on the brakes, running after me, demanding his money. But instead, he just drove off. That was a massive red flag. Why wouldn't he try to stop me? Why didn't he care about the fare? The fact that he fled the second I made a run for it only confirmed my worst suspicions. He had no intention of just giving me a ride home. I slowed my pace, catching my breath as I approached the police officer's window. He rolled it down, looking confused. I quickly explained, that taxi driver was acting really weird, and I didn't feel safe, so I ran. The officer nodded, and when I asked if he could take me home, he thankfully agreed. I hopped into the back seat, relieved beyond words. By the time we pulled up to my apartment, I was exhausted. I locked the door behind me, brushed my teeth, and collapsed into bed. But just as I was about to drift off, there was a knock at my door. My stomach dropped. I froze. The knocking continued. Was it the taxi driver? He had my address. He knew where I lived. For several minutes, the knocking persisted. Then, silence. Then, more knocking. I never left my room. I just hoped, prayed, that whoever it was would leave. And eventually, they did. The next day, I returned to work with a slightly later shift, which was a relief since it meant I didn't have to wake up too early. While I was at work, I received an unexpected call from my neighbor, Mark. He told me that my father had been at my apartment earlier, trying to get in. Apparently, my dad had been there to drop something off, but he didn't have a key. Mark was just calling to confirm that I was expecting him. I told him I hadn't heard anything from my dad about a visit. Mark mentioned that he hadn't seen my dad leave anything behind, but he had noticed him peeking through the windows, which caught his attention. I thanked Mark for keeping an eye out and quickly called my dad. As expected, my dad was at work and hadn't come by my place at all. I took the opportunity to explain everything about the strange taxi driver incident to him once again, though this time over the phone. My dad, concerned, insisted I come home for a few nights, and I agreed, but I told him I needed to pack first. When I got home around 9 p.m., I started to finish up the laundry I hadn't completed the night before and packed a bag with some clothes and my work stuff for the next few days. But something about the apartment didn't feel right. I've never been one to get nervous when I'm alone, but tonight, there was an undeniable feeling that I wasn't truly by myself. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the stress from the taxi driver situation that had put me on edge. But I kept hearing small creaks in the floor, like someone's weight shifting, but I couldn't figure out where the sound was coming from. It was unsettling, and I began to rush through my packing, trying to get everything together as quickly as possible. As I was just about to leave, I heard a creak from the hallway near the spare room. I froze. Then, I heard a voice, a deep, unsettling voice, that said, "I'm not going to hurt you." My heart skipped a beat, and I saw a figure step into view, an arm swinging around the corner. Without thinking, I bolted for the front door, panic rising in my chest. I was out the door in seconds, pounding on Mark's door, yelling for help. Thankfully, he and his wife were awake and rushed outside. I was frantic, begging them to help me. We didn't even enter the apartment right away. We called the police and waited for them to arrive. When the officers finally showed up, they quickly searched the apartment, checking every possible hiding spot. The sliding door to the shared backyard was open, suggesting the intruder might have fled that way. Unfortunately, I didn't have any concrete information about the taxi ride, no license plate number, no cab company. All I could tell them was that it had been a yellow minivan and described the driver. I also gave them a vague description of the route we had taken and the approximate time I had entered the city, hoping they could access local cameras to see if they had caught anything. Afterward, I grabbed my things and went to stay with my parents for a week. They wanted me to stay longer, but I eventually had to return to my apartment. My dad helped me install security cameras at both the front and back doors, and I bought a taser to keep by my bed for peace of mind. Since then, I've moved to 2 different apartments, but I've never had to use the taser. I've also avoided taxis whenever I'm alone. They're just too hard to trace, and the stories about fake taxi drivers and kidnappings make me wonder whether the driver I encountered was even a real taxi driver at all, or if the vehicle had been stolen.